Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Today we're joined by John Wood Jr. He's the National Ambassador for Braver Angels. I'm glad we managed to get him on because one of the topics of conversation that he engages in is one in which I think the national discourse on is in complete shambles. A conversation on race is one that I certainly think can be had, but the fact that the books that are becoming national bestsellers and appearing on promotional tables in bookstores like Barnes & Noble are of the white fragility and how to be an anti-racist variety is nothing short of astounding. I'd be surprised if you managed to find a John McWhorter or a Shelby Steele on those promotional tables, or a John Wood Jr. being brought up in a positive light in a university lecture on race. The ideas permeating books like Between the World and Me and academic disciplines like critical race theory are brought up, and I tried to make sure that I brought them up without the agenda of just beating them into the ground. I tried to do my best to honestly ask if there are any ideas within CRT or anti-racist books that we can actually say are good. I think the conversation was definitely fruitful. If you're listening to this on iTunes or any other podcast distributor, you can watch the video podcast on our YouTube channel, The Babylon Project. Anyways, hope you enjoy this episode.
Shut up and sit down.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, joined by my good friend Bruce. Bruce, once more, thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here. Good way to kick off 2021.
That's right. So we're kicking off 2021 with a bang, and I'm very excited about tonight's guest because this is someone whom this is actually the first time that we can have a conversation about race, because this is one of the topics where I think that we're just so discombobulated on here in this country and elsewhere, of course. So I'm very happy to have the National Ambassador at Braver Angels here, John Wood Jr. Mr. Woods, thank you so much for joining us.
Vincent, Bruce, it's good to be on with you guys. It's a real pleasure.
Mr. Wood, I first heard of you on Brett Weinstein's Dark Horse podcast. You were on there with greats like Chloe Valderay, Glenn Laurie, and Camille Foster, and so many others. I knew the message you were all sending out had to be amplified as soon as I saw it, so we absolutely had to try to have you on. Although I didn't think it would be under these kinds of circumstances beginning 2021. So there are a lot of questions I want to ask you about the prospects of depolarization, and we'll definitely get into it later on in this podcast, especially what direction we need to take. But I'd like to ask if you could take a minute to maybe plug the Braver Angels organization and its mission. I think you guys are doing very, very important work now.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So like you said, I'm a national ambassador for Braver Angels. Braver Angels is the largest grassroots bipartisan organization in America working on the issue of political depolarization. But really the way to understand that word in our context is what we're working towards is sort of the renewal of the spirit of democratic society in America across partisan divides, across also racial and religious and other salient divisions in our society as well. And so our work is geared towards giving people the tools, the techniques, and the context for building up their own capacity for being able to listen and communicate across divisions, to bring out the best each other and to open up avenues for actual collaboration to take place in different sectors of American society, in different American communities. And so we have programs and workshops that are dedicated to giving people opportunity to, well, I was going to say physically convene, although obviously most of what we're doing now is virtually based. But our programs give people the opportunity to speak from the vantage point of their own personal experience in terms of why they see politics the way they do, through sort of marriage counseling exercises that give the opportunity for there to be sort of windows of understanding between the two sides. Excuse me. We have programs that are debate oriented, that give people the opportunity to challenge each other's positions on different perspectives, but in an environment of intellectual humility, in a context that prizes sort of the communal pursuit of truth, if you will, over owning or vanquishing your opponent. We have workshops and programs that we deploy specifically for, or that we've deployed for for congressional staffers, for state legislatures. But yeah, we've got programs that are meant for elected officials, state and local level. Things that we do within corporations. We have campus-based activities, and we have our own fledgling media network. I'm a co-host of the Braver Angels podcast. We've got a team of writers, video content, and so we seek to renew the spirit of democratic society, to strengthen the social fabric in America across sectors in American life: government, academia, journalism, media, but with a particular focus on grassroots communities. So that's Braver Angels and sort of what we do in a walloping nutshell.
I think it's an incredibly tremendously important thing to focus on here in the United States, especially when you have, as you mentioned, there seems to be an increase in political polarization that is occurring. Whether you're looking at both, the Democrats or the Republicans. Matt Taibbi wrote a great book on this, as did Ezra Klein recently, on why we're so polarized. And we and you also have a great podcast, as you mentioned, the Braver Angels podcast, to which we actually had one of your guests on. You recently made a friend, Stacia Wilson. We had her on not too long ago, who made an impressive first appearance. But yeah, fantastic. And so I'm glad that this organization exists. I think this is one of the most important conversations that needs to be had. And why is it so incredibly difficult to have a seemingly benign conversation with someone who's across the political aisle? And so I'm glad that you guys are doing the work that you're doing. And one of the conversations to me that seems to be so nuclear, where it's almost impossible to have an honest conversation with this, and it's one that is entirely identity based, which, promoting the Enlightenment liberal values that I do, it's not a conversation that I'm very happy that identity plays such a large role in. And that is, of course, the conversation about race, in which there seems to be some heavy level of discombobulation about what is and isn't allowed to be said, especially based on who you are, because the game of politics that is being played here is that what matters most, or at the very least what should be of paramount importance, is your positionality, is where you place yourself, for one, on the racial hierarchy, of course, but also two, on the class hierarchy, because your position in class is also going to inform your views about race. And so the first thing that I want to ask you, and you brought this up when you were talking with Bret Weinstein about this, where one of the things that I've noticed that I really do not like is this idea that there is something that is referred to as the Black perspective, or the minority perspective, or what, fill in the blank perspective here. Because if that's the case, the expectation would be that based on the color of your skin, based on any immutable characteristic of yours, you should hold a particular viewpoints. And they go so far as to say that it's not enough to be Black, you have to be politically Black now. It's not enough to be gay, you have to be politically gay. So, and then also you, of course, you basically completely alienate the views of Black intellectuals like Coleman Hughes or Glenn Loury or John McWhorter or yourself. So what are your thoughts on this idea that there even is such a thing as a Black perspective, given just how diverse the Black community is?
Right. Yeah. So there's a tension, I think, that exists in social reality. A tension which in some respects is determinative of, I think, of perhaps almost the entire catalog of social divisions that you can identify in a given context if you draw it out far enough. Although I'd have to think about that a little bit. But there's a tension that exists between the reality of the individual, the sort of sovereignty of the individual, and the particular sort of unique combination of influences, experiences, perspectives that each of us amounts to in our singular being, versus the sort of generalized reality of the fact that we exist in society in relationship to each other, in context where we share more or less of the experiences of other folks, be it culturally, be it in terms of ethnic or political or class-based history, as you mentioned. And therefore, there are sort of degrees to which we accumulate generalized perspectives that represent the general point of view of particular groups, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not coincidence that laborers tend to have a similar sort of political orientation, all right, in terms of, their stance on policies. On the one hand, there's certain policies which are going to tend to sort of accrue to the interests of the laboring class more generally than they are to the capital holding class. But you're also going to have cultural memories shared even within that context. People who have lived a life of work and labor have the experience of having to unite with others to build up their capacity to bargain for adequate wages, redressing of grievances. They've experienced social dynamics where they find themselves at the mercy, let's say, of the employer class and what have you. And this develops sort of shared social memories that are generalized out over time and across this group, and it leads to a group mentality, generally speaking. Ethnic cultures work in a similar way in the Black community, but in other communities as well, obviously, in all other communities. But in the Black experience, so to speak, there is a broad history that in the United States in particular, and in the Americas, of course, begins with slavery. You have a culture that begins to germinate in the Americas, in the United States in particular. This creates a certain narrative that winds up traveling through different episodes of history and winds up linking in a generalized fashion folks who are themselves the descendants of American slaves in this particular moment to a larger arc of experience in history. And these things have political implications that lead to this pressure where the tension arises between the group and the individual. Because en masse, there's a certain sense that we've traveled a certain length of time and experience as a group, that there are certain things that we've learned and certain struggles that we're up against that lead to a certain sort of political consensus in terms of how we ought to be acting in the present moment. But it is always possible for an individual to deviate from that, or for groups within the larger group to deviate from whatever that consensus looks like. And there's a pernicious thing that happens sometimes in that context where the larger group seems to feel itself threatened by that deviation, and the social penalty one pays for stepping out of that becomes risking isolation, ostracization, excommunication, however you want to put it. But I think that those tensions it's good to identify the reality of those social forces and how they interact with each other, rather than dismiss the reality of that. I do think that there is such a thing as group psychology for reasons that are not simply extraneous, or that are not merely regressive, at least in every context. I think that human beings evolve to be social creatures. Identity is part of the glue that sticks us to each other. And even if it's the case that a person can graduate in some sense, or look at themselves as graduating from making an ethnic identity primary to making perhaps a philosophical or intellectual identity primary. Let's say I don't think of myself as being Black or Hispanic as much as I think of myself as being a classical liberal. Let's say I am identifying myself with my ideals, my philosophy, the way I think, the way I walk and move in the world. That still places me in a social context where I'm redefining the lines of social connection according to a different premise, but those lines of social connection are still there. Liberalism unites people under an umbrella of values and perspectives that itself lends to a certain social context that you can move in and out of, right? And all sorts of things proceed from that. So I don't, I tend not to be a person who tries to, or whose instinct at least is to undermine the notion that it is valid to embrace a group identity. I think that that's perfectly legitimate and perfectly fine. I think the question always is, regardless of what larger kind of group identity you may subscribe to, or how you might define yourself as an individual, do you have a perspective that allows you to transcend that label or category in favor of some superordinate identification with the well-being of humanity, more broadly speaking, with the well-being of humanity beyond whatever your proximal group affiliation might be? Because if you don't have that capacity to transcend whatever label is most, directly applicable to you in your own mind, you lose the capacity to act in any way that seeks to build community, and that seeks to uplift civilization beyond the borders of your own tribe, which means that at a certain point you're going to become inward facing and morally narrow and destructive in the way you act out for the interests of your tribe. And so it's at that point which I begin to take issue with the consequences of some of these some of the results of our group psychology. But I don't dismiss it categorically. I don't dismiss identity politics as being something that is, by definition, I think, at least as I understand identity politics, a negative in the context of human psychology. I think it's fairly inevitable, in fact, that we will have an identity politics of one variety or another.
Well, as for identity politics is where it goes, I mean, I think you pretty much summed it up well, excellently right there. Because identity politics, I think, just as in anything, the argument for and against it always occurs in a spectrum. Mm-hmm. Some of the intellectuals that who I've become admirers of, like the one that comes to mind right now is Thomas Chatterton Williams. Like, I've read both of his books, and he introduces these viewpoints that I think are very well worth thinking about, in which through his travels in Europe and through the context of his own life, he goes through a journey of, like, what does it mean to be quote unquote black? What does it mean to be of this or that ethnicity? And he's met so many people who have external characteristics that seem to, for better or worse, mark them as a part of this group or not. But their individual journey has, as you say, molded them into an individual that's unique, but that's nonetheless still tied, however, somewhat to that group, although they're somewhat disjoined from it. But there's always this pressure to almost always identify with your ethnic group. Right. And it can make for some very, very tacky circumstances in this political atmosphere. I mean, like earlier during the summer, the example I usually always give is when Black Lives Matter was much more in the spotlight. There was a group that said Asians for Black Lives Matter, and it was an example of someone saying, I speak for this entire community, but we see the same problem there. What do you mean by Asian? Do you mean Asian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean? Do you mean Asian as an ABC, American-born Chinese, as someone who just came from the mainland? Their perspectives are so completely different that overall group, it exists, but it's so diverse. And right. Who are we to speak for an entire community? And so how is it possible for the individual how is it socially acceptable for an individual to walk outside of that path, especially since it's so PC to say, like, I belong to this group nowadays, which I think is a very poisonous perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so you asked the question, how is it, or how can it be socially acceptable for an individual to walk out of the language, the cultural sort of context, the signaling, the expectations of what at least might be presenting itself to be these sort of cultural mainstream of a given group or subgroup? Is that, am I grasping the question?
Yes. For example, I believe Camille Foster, he doesn't think of himself as black, because I think he says he doesn't want to be tied down to, like, say, to his external characteristics. I might be butchering his definition there. So, Mr. Foster, if you're listening to this, my apologies. It's not my intent, but that's the example.
Thomas has said something similar.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Sure. Right. So in an ideal world, a person could do that and be met with a live and let live response from others of his or her hue, so to speak, right? Um, it it ought not, I think, be the case that yes, you have a group of people. Maybe they are the mainstream. Maybe they are, in fact, just sort of a louder, or more vocal minority within a group. Nevertheless, it ought to be able to be the fact that you have some group that chooses to orient itself around a group identification and pursue social or cultural outcomes in a way that in ways that they feel are linked to the interests of that group or the implications of that group identity, while at the same time not taking a hostile attitude to people who say, you know what, this group identification has different implications for me. I don't necessarily share in all of the premises that it seems to rest upon. I share a cultural origin with you, with this larger group. I share an ancestry with this larger group. I have perhaps cultural or social overlap, but I define myself as an individual in a different way. Um, in an ideal world, there would simply be a live and let live response to that that allows folks of these differing these different cultural postures to interact with each other productively, to explore differences and tensions where they may exist, and ultimately move forward content to be different, right? Because we are going to be different in all sorts of different ways. But I recognize the fact that that is frequently not the reality, and the fact that that's not the reality is the occasion, I guess, for our conversation here. You know, people in these people in groups who feel that identification with the interest or the agenda of the group, uh, people who feel that that is threatened by deviation from that, will oftentimes try to apply a social penalty to people who depart from that. But I do think though that as Confucius said, it's always better to light a candle than to curse the dark, and that's how I try to live. I don't linger too long on the negative reality of this dynamic, because ultimately it exists for a reason. If we want to think in evolutionary sorts of terms, I know not everybody believes in group selection and so on and so forth, but it seems like a compelling kind of idea to me. And I think that groups inevitably will again orient themselves around premises and cultural markers that they share, in part because we do naturally come to identify with each other on the basis of commonalities, and therefore groups will tend to operate in ways that seek to preserve the interests and expand the well-being of that spectrum of shared identification, right? And so I think the question becomes, how do you converse with that mentality productively if you stand outside of it, right? What can you do to enter into a dialogue which perhaps protects you, but also allows you to maybe impart some perspective to folks who are of that point of view? And I think that the way you go about doing that has to arise from not so much from being a sort of a polemical genius or somebody who's outstanding in the area of debating his or her defending his or her position in debate. I think that the thing that allows you to have constructive conversations across these divisions is rooted in deeper sorts of virtues. I'm a student of the philosophy of nonviolence, the philosophy that Martin Luther King Jr. Was the sort of primary vessel for into the mainstream of the civil rights movement, but it's philosophy that precedes Dr. King. Nonviolence, not to be excused with not to be confused with mere pacifism, rests on this idea that that love, or what you can define as agape love, meaning goodwill in essence, is not just a personal, but a social value and a virtue by which we can speak to the conscience of those who who not just who agree with us, but who disagree with us, and even those who are in virulent opposition to our interests and who we are. The idea is in the nonviolent philosophy, we discipline ourselves not to harbor sort of hateful or resentful or fearful thoughts towards the other, and that in our communication, in our dialogue, in our actions, we signal that we seek the well-being and the interests of those people we disagree with or are struggling against, even as we may be opposing them in the context of a social or a political relationship, right? So it should be possible for us to signal goodwill to people who have an antagonistic view of ourselves, our stated identities, our politics, even while we make the case in favor of what we believe and in contrast to what it is they believe.
Mhm.
So, I mean, if I'm, engaging with somebody whose worldview is so Afrocentric that they see no redeeming, values in the principles that underlie the founding of the United States and the classical liberal project and the humanistic project or what have you, and in general, I don't think that many folks are quite so far gone, right? Because I don't think that there's any real contradiction between being a person who prizes your African and African American lineage and culture, and at the same time, also being a champion of those other values and traditions as well. But if I am to come across somebody in that way, my attitude towards them is not, look, you're regressive and backwards and you're taking humanity back to the Stone Age, right? And inwardly, I'm trying not to think that way about them. Inwardly, I'm thinking this is a person who's a product of a certain experience, a product of a certain history, somebody who has their own particular subjectivity that's led them to this point of view that I think is doing damage. But all individuals have a need to learn. All people have the opportunity to change. Let me signal the fact that I believe some things that I think have some value, and maybe what I believe could have some value for you. Here's why I have to put my point of view forward in a way that you're likely to disagree with, but I'm hoping leads us to be able to share in a greater truth if we can keep the dialogue going. All of that sort of philosophical Pollyannish kind of framing is what actually leads us in the direction of being able to signal to somebody the idea that, yes, I disagree with you. No, you are not my enemy, not truly my enemy, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing that we all tend to default into is a way of interacting with each other where, whether explicitly or implicitly, we draw these lines of cultural and ideological divisions between each other. But then the thing that follows from that is this idea that therefore we are in personal opposition to one another. And that becomes the reality because we accept that as the reality, right? But these things, even though they're contradictions between an individualist perspective, between a sort of a classical liberal perspective and the types of identity politics that I think many of us are very concerned about, even though there's substantive contradictions there, I don't believe that there has to be necessarily the type of divisions that keep us from being able to enter into dialogue with each other if this other piece is there, if that nonviolent piece, so to speak, if goodwill can persist there. But you have to be willing to accept the fact that, goodwill is not always going to be returned to you. It's something that strengthens you over time to practice it, and it's something that makes an impact on those who you communicate with over time, right? But in the meantime, the Bible says, as it defines love as being long-suffering. What the idea is there is that if you are loving and empathetic and charitable and understanding to people, some folks will punish you for that, right? But over time, you give the fire of animosity less fuel to burn, and eventually, the momentum starts to go the other way. So that's the social sort of philosophy and practice that I employ in communicating across these philosophical divisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you did a great job at mentioning that tension between good tribalism versus bad tribalism, where the good ones, the fact of the matter is that we are biologically predispositioned to act tribal, and how do we make sure to ensure that that doesn't become dangerous? Whereas you said we now have some violent animosity tendencies towards people who are different from us. we can recognize that maybe there is some value in being proud of your culture or being proud of your nationality, while at the same time recognizing that there are some instances in which that can go way too far, and that can lead towards the level of political polarization that we're seeing now. And so you also one of the things that gets brought up a lot among this conversation is the concept of color blindness, where on the one end you have many people on the progressive left who make the argument that the level of socialization that plays into how we see reality, that plays into how we see race relations, is so strong to the point where pretending to even be aspiring for color blindness is silly. You can't say, whether they're talking about the implicit association test or whether we're talking about just implicit biases that we have in general. The socialization that exists is too strong to ignore, to even pretend to want to be colorblind. Whereas on the other end, you'll say that yes, we recognize that we have biases, but the fact of the matter is that the best way to override those biases, or to head towards society in which race matters as little as possible, where, as Sam Harris says, race should be the least interesting thing about you. The best way to go towards that society is to act as if we're colorblind. We recognize that we're not literally colorblind. It's impossible to be that, or maybe you might disagree. But so long as we're acting that way, we're trying to get there. That's as best as that's the best case scenario for race relations. So what are your thoughts on colorblindness? Are there some merits to the argument that our socialization is just too strong, or maybe they're being too catastrophic about that?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I think, as you indicated, there are ways of understanding what the idea of color blindness is signaling that are more or less sophisticated, more or less nuanced, or more or less naive, depending on how you're evaluating it. On the one hand, so I can sympathize with a critique of color blindness, which says that, look, people say that they're colorblind, but what they really mean is that they are casting a blind eye to the implications of my cultural and social station. They are not seeing the ways in which my own position in the social structure of things leads me to have a different level of access, a different level of privilege, so to speak, a different position in the hierarchy, which makes me more vulnerable to certain sorts of pressures or outcomes, what have you. Or they are casting a blind eye at the ways in which my own cultural demeanor, my own dialect, my own sorts of ways of behaving and entering into a space mark me as somebody who's just going to interact differently with my circumstances in ways that actually have implications for my own well-being in a given context. People can look at color blindness as willfully ignoring important components of a person's reality. I think it can play out that way. On the other hand, what color blindness is striving towards is, I think, precisely what you say, and precisely is necessary, precisely is needed. A mentality that ultimately seeks to judge individuals on the basis of components of their being that are ultimately transcendent of whatever our phenotypical or even sort of ethnic and cultural qualities happen to be, right? And I think that is what we should be striving towards. And I think it is possible. I mean, it is the idea that we judge one another based on the content of each other's characters and not on the color of one another's skin. I quote Martin Luther King Jr. quite a bit in my work, and that's the quote that I use almost the least, because it's sort of the only thing that many folks remember that Dr. King said, and that's part of the frustration that some folks have with the colorblind sort of perspective, is that it boils down to this idea that we ignore color in order to see character. And yet, you can see character, you can prioritize character in your evaluation of another person without necessarily being blind to other social implications or other cultural implications of where that person is coming from, ethnically, socially, etc. You can develop an ability to say, okay, so you come from an inner city community, you come from a certain sort of educational background, you come from a certain religious background, you're likely to bring certain ways of speaking, certain ways of interacting with the world into this space. Let me understand that. And if that has some implications, let me be mindful of that. But ultimately, the question is, are you honest? Are you fair? Are you a person of your word? Do you show integrity? Are you a person who values honor? Are you willing to commit to a task and see it through? Can you be gentle and empathetic with other people who are themselves coming from other walks of life? That's where the central analysis has to come in. And there is no contradiction ultimately between centering that analysis, that evaluation of somebody's character, with being sensitive to whatever the implications of a person's, of other facets of a person's identity may be. So that's what we want to strive towards. And that's what I was getting at earlier in terms of the need for us to have even if we do subscribe to a certain sort of identity politics, the need for us to have a superordinate sort of understanding of the well-being of humanity that transcends the borders of whatever our subgroup politics or perspectives may be. There needs to be a higher layer to it, both in terms of how we look at humanity on the group level and how we look at each other on the individual level. And so I think that that's ultimately what Harris and other folks are getting at, but that's how I would describe it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the most interesting things that I've come across where there was a point a few months ago where I was doing nothing but reading books about race, because it's just, as I mentioned before, it's one of the topics that I think the United States people in general just are ill-equipped to talk about. So I read Thomas Chatterton Williams, John McWhorter, as well as Ta-Nehisi Coates and Robin DiAngelo, and I also started reading some introductory course materials on critical race theory that is often taught. And one of the main themes in critical race theory literature, specific, one of the a pretty good one to read if you just want a TLDR of what it is Introduction to Critical Race Theory by Delgado, for those listening. And one of the things that is often brought up is that the concept of progress is contentious, to say the least. Some of them go so far as to say that there was no such thing as progress because the attitudes and the mentalities, the racist attitudes and mentalities that are exhibited by white people simply went from explicit attitudes towards implicit ones. And they'll say things like the only reason why white people granted black people their rights is because it was in their benefit to do so. And that you have that on one end, and then another school of thought within CRT is that, well, it's contentious to say that there even is progress. And progress seems to be one of the most seemingly obvious things that to most people we had. It seems obvious to us at the very least that there was progress. So why do you think, well, for one, do you think there's some merits in the arguments made by them that, yeah, maybe there is some merit to the idea that white people only gave black people their rights because there was some advantage towards them through doing so, or maybe that's misguided. And do you think, why do you think people have this mentality about progress when it seems so obvious to us, at least, that there has been progress since the 60s?
Right. Yeah. Ibram Kendi in How to Be an Anti-Racist makes a distinction between racist progress and anti-racist progress. Wherein racist progress is a type of progress that, regardless of what's happening on the surface, I think is ultimately reinforcing the stratification that exists between the races, the reinforcing white supremacy in essence. Whereas anti-racist progress is that progress which strives to deconstruct and disassemble that white supremacist social architecture. But to your point, it's clear to me that human progress is a real thing, that social progress is a real thing, that it's been real in the United States of America, and that it is, of course, also visible in the period of time that has elapsed since the end of the civil rights movement to now. I do think that that progress with respect to the material well-being of the African American community in particular is, in many respects, grossly overestimated. And I would look at myself as having grossly overestimated it for some period of time, in large part because when we talk about the African American community, as you said earlier in the podcast here, the Black community is diverse. There are all sorts of different folks, different types of folks within it. But that's not just true on an ideological and on a philosophical level. It's also true in the context of streams of socio-economic development, even within this narrow period of time that extends from, let's say, 1965 or so, or what have you, to 2020. There are a number of things that happened during that period of time which led, I think, to an arc of material progress that is concentrated in particular within a segment or subsegment of the Black community within which I find myself residing, really. A segment of the Black community that in the aftermath of the fall of Jim Crow integrated into middle class and white suburban communities, was brought into universities, that went into the sort of the entertainment industry and politics, and found itself sort of integrated with a more mobile, a more elite sector of general American society in a few different sectors in particular, again, politics, academia, entertainment, so on and so forth. While at the same time, you had a bit of a social capital and an intellectual capital and maybe cultural capital drain from many Black communities who themselves are finding working class opportunities disappearing, the disappearance of manufacturing overseas, the insourcing of economic competition from other countries in the Americas, and within the agricultural sector, within the service sector. At the same time, you have the introduction of a welfare system that did a lot to eliminate hunger, did a lot to alleviate the worst impacts of poverty, but that also provided a mere subsistence income that, particularly back in the early years, was based on incentivizing the absence of fathers from the household, sort of in a policy way, rewarding single parent households in a manner that undermined Black families. And on top of that, you ultimately had the importation of heroin and ultimately crack cocaine in a way to where you had disposable income financing sort of a Black market industry in the absence of social mobility and economic opportunity that generated an underground economy of violence, which invited a backlash from sort of the police state, which winds up incarcerating a great portion of particularly young Black men over the course of 20 or 30 years or so. We now live in a moment where many of the folks who were incarcerated in those years are finding themselves, out back in society, sort of getting back up on their feet. But the memory of those years that defined the relationship between the Black community and the police department, the scars of that cultural memory is now becoming more amplified in the mainstream political Black conversation, so on and so forth. And that's part of what's animating the social language of Black Lives Matter, so on and so forth. So the point that I'm making is that if you are a Black American in that series of circumstances, if you're on that track versus the track that, a lot of Black folks more similar to myself were on, the folks who grew up like I did in integrated communities. I grew up in a multicultural middle-class suburb, Culver City, California. I'm biracial. There are other Black folks who weren't, but who still grew up in a context where I had access, higher levels of educational access. I had relationships with white people and authorities and institutions that were more constructive. There's a stream of the Black experience where that grows. There's more of that from the end of the civil rights movement to now. But that other story I told you, that speaks for a great many Black people as well, right? And then there's just all sorts of, variation in between those poles. So, but all that to say that I do think that there's more to when people say that the progress made in the aftermath of the civil rights movement is overestimated. Um, I think that there's definitely something to that. But here's the other side of that coin. I do believe that the United States of America became dramatically less racist in that period of time at the exact same time when certain other structural factors that correspond to race became more pernicious. So I talked about the welfare state, the interaction with the changing in the economic landscape, the influx of drugs, the police response. These are all structural and systemic sort of variables that are tied to the racial history that got worse. But interpersonally, socially, America became far more tolerant. And I exist as a product of that too. Interracial marriage became something that, broadly speaking, was acceptable in the United States. The most visible representatives of American cultural identity internationally became African Americans. I mean, from Muhammad Ali to Michael Jordan to Michael Jackson to Oprah Winfrey, ultimately Barack Obama, of course, at the highest level. There are more integrated communities. I'm a product of that. The problem with the overarching narrative of anti-racism is that it collapses all historical and all historical, social, and structural patterns of development or evolution over time. It collapses all of them. It even collapses the development of psychology on the individual level as being the mere consequence of a single variable. And that is in human history, and that is the variable of elite white people seeking the interests of elite white people, right? There is a way in which, and I guess it's true as far as it goes. I mean, there is a way in which if you want to rewind the clock and go back to the founding of the slave trade, you can certainly draw out a series of dominoes that said, okay, well, in Kendi's analysis and the analysis of others, certain elite white people invented the slave trade, justified it on the basis of racial differences. Racism was basically invented as a power tool, which other white people who weren't actually benefiting from it grabbed onto it socially because that's what it was presented to them as. We're not going to share economic opportunity with you poor white people, but we'll give you the psychological luxury of thinking that you're superior to black people. This will help us maintain the racial hierarchy for the benefits of the slave-holding elite, the plantation bosses in the South, and whoever else is benefiting from the system at the uppermost levels. You can draw out this analysis, and there's something to it. But many, many other things are happening at the exact same time, all throughout history. You do have a religious conversation that's evolving, a theological dialectic over what does it mean to be a child of God, right? Is there racial stratification that is acknowledged in the scriptures, or is a Christian God one that has created all of us equal? You have a secular liberal conversation that's unfolding across the exact same sort of axis, right? When Thomas Jefferson writes, all men are created equal, does he mean all men are created equal literally? What are the implications of what Locke wrote? What are the implications of the Enlightenment? What is the implications of our larger sort of humanistic project, right? You have the evolution of that dynamic as well. You have the genuine intermarrying, intermingling, integrating through popular culture, through sexuality, through mere geographic proximity, through sharing a workplace together. You have all these different ways in which the relationships between white people and black people and all folks, in the United States of America finds itself melding together to where people have to ask themselves questions in terms of what is the significance of our phenotypical differences, right? And so, human history is multivariate. Just like as individuals, we are dramatically more complicated than merely our racial or cultural or phenotypic sort of, identity, even if that is an aspect of who we are. And even if for some of us it's a particularly important aspect because it correlates to all sorts of other things, culturally and experientially and historically, that connecting to politics, etc. Um, but in collapsing all human reality into this one variable, this univariate thing that says that it is all consequence of white supremacy, is to collapse our understanding of society as well as the individual into a stereotype that doesn't allow us to interact with the whole human person. And that's what you see. That's the distortion that comes through in many versions of anti-racism, particularly the sort of anti-racism that I think Robin DiAngelo cultivates, this sort of anti-racism that I view as being at odds with the moral substance of nonviolence, largely because nonviolence seeks to speak to the conscience of an individual and seeks to bring them into community in a way that transcends the implications of race and class differences, even while it does not seek to be blind to them. The sort of white fragility project sort of seeks to treat white people in particular as being merely defined by the cultural pathologies attendant to whiteness in this analysis, and then seeks to, in essence, bring to bear a severe degree of sort of psychological or social penalty for these prejudices that it views as being inevitable in white people, for the purposes of ultimately sort of breaking white people into contrition so that people of color can have their proper space. But in that, there's no, at least in the way it is practiced and the way it is preached in some cases, and there are different versions of anti-racism. Kendi is not as guilty of this as DiAngelo, and we could go into all that. But in the worst versions of anti-racism, it is a matter of breaking white people psychologically in order to empower people of color, and in so doing, creating distortions in everybody and obliterating our capacity to really come into community with one another as equals. And so this is why we have to appreciate the whole human being in his or her complexity, to also be able to appreciate the complexity of human society. And it is why we have to have a morally transcendent way of engaging with each other that goes beyond the implications of any one variable or another in the direction of engaging with this entire picture of the human being. And so that's what I have for.
Right. Over the last couple of years, I've become a fan of Mr. Thomas Sowell's work. He definitely breaks up he dispels a lot of conceptions about race, and I also become familiar with Glenn Loury and Coleman Hughes's exhortations of his work, which makes it clear that the issue of race is something that's just very, very complicated. It's much more so than what DiAngelo or Kendi would have it be, and there's a lot of nuance that needs to be recognized for a long overdue conversation our society needs to have. But I'd like to take a brief a detour here and talk about about depolarization efforts and what will it take us to do so, especially in this kind of environment. For my own sanity, I have to take occasional breaks from Twitter, as you can imagine why. If you look on that website, it's almost like we're embroiled in just this incredible civil war between two sides on a philosophical basis, and no one really wants to communicate or speak to each other. I have to remind myself that Twitter is not a representative of the entire society as a whole, but it does raise an interesting question about the trope, let people want to believe whatever they believe. Now, several years ago, I was very sympathetic to this, but right now I'm really not so sure. Because beliefs ultimately end up shaping our values, our behaviors, and even common sense. We see this with denialism, and on the flip side, we also see this with fetishization. So about letting people believe what they believe, I'm not so sure this is a tenable a social tenet we can afford to continue to hold in the near or even the far future. I wanted to get your thoughts on that area.
Right. Well, beliefs have consequences, to be certain. So I hear you asking whether or not the sort of, let people believe what they want to believe kind of laissez-faire, hands-off approach to subjective points of view is something that does that invite catastrophe at a certain point?
Yeah.
But look, I think that there are tensions and trade-offs in all things, right? And part of what, if we're going to be sophisticated in seeking to advance the well-being of society and the culture of democracy, we have to be committed to is recognizing the fact that many projects unfold simultaneously. If we have the rampant spread of misinformation in a way that, let's say, convinces people that the entire phenomenon is a conspiracy to get people to take a vaccine, which ultimately is going to, let's just say something fantastical, just to, crystallize it, is going to sort of, implant sort of microchips into your bloodstream that's going to make you sort of like controllable by the central apparatus of the machine state or whatnot. If you have the spread of that kind of disinformation, it's going to have material consequences for our ability to save lives, right? And so the spread of disinformation has to be counteracted. And you do that through messaging, you do that through trying to shoot down bad ideas, so on and so forth. But in order to be most effective, people are going to, as they are now, start thinking about ways to directly cut off the floodgates of misinformation, ways that are likely going to have implications for free speech. And suddenly we are looking at threats to a fundamental ideal of our society, this idea that we do have the right and the liberty to say what we believe, to think what we believe, the right to be wrong, right? And the need for us to be able to have our thoughts unpoliced ultimately by the state, so on and so forth. There becomes a tension between these two things. Yes. Now, the separate projects here wind up being, on the one hand, how do you communicate accurate information or limit the spread of misinformation while still being able to maximize liberty, right? Now, the project that people always skip over because we just take it for granted is the project of building trust between people as individuals and communities, between Americans and their institutions, ultimately. A big part of the reason why we distrust our sources of authority is because we see our authorities as themselves playing roles in our culture wars, right? And so if I look at Dr. Fauci and think, well, this person is an arm of this person is an appendage of the state, of the deep state, maybe, of the establishment, of the institution, in a way to where I know he's trying to serve the political interests of a certain class, and therefore I can't trust anything he says. If I believe that about Dr. Fauci, there has already been a series of ruptures leading up to my belief in that idea, between me and the institutions, between me and my fellow Americans within a certain political party, that themselves have to, I think, ultimately begin to be repaired before we can have credibility reattend sort of the flow of actual accurate information. So there has to be a diplomatic project of getting the American people to listen to each other again and to reason with each other again from the starting point of goodwill. And I refer us back to nonviolence, in a way that allows us to signal to each other, look, we're trying to communicate what we believe about I'm trying to communicate to you that the vaccine is something that's important. We should take it for your individual well-being, for the well-being of society. But let me send the signal that me saying this to you is not to signal that I'm an enemy of your political and your social, that I'm not an enemy of you, right? I'm not saying that you should take the vaccine because I, in my position of influence or what have you, am an arm of the deep, am a finger of the deep state. I'm saying this because I am your neighbor and I have some goodwill for you. And maybe I'm being fooled. Maybe maybe someone's pulled the wool over my eyes. But if you have some part of the truth that I don't have, then let's enter into that communal conversation and share the truth together. And maybe we'll come to a place where we both can see things more clearly. That's the Braver Angels project, right? That's the project that, that I and other people are dedicated to create the space for genuine listening, because the more that project succeeds, the more, first of all, the more genuinely credible and persuasive information, that is to say, the more points of view that are rooted in, I think, moral truth and empirical truth will likely rise to the top, right? In that dialectic, if we believe, and it's generally the liberal instinct to believe, small L liberal instinct to believe, that ultimately truth has persuasive power when it is allowed to be decoupled from the social prejudices that oftentimes distort what should otherwise be conversations that strive towards objectivity. If you can reduce that context of prejudice and animosity, genuinely well-founded perspectives should have an advantage in the marketplace of ideas. If you believe that, then establishing a context of goodwill surrounding those conversations is going to be the most empowering thing you can do to allow the truth to break through. But I will grant that that is a long-term project. It is also a project that can do short-term good and does do short-term good, but it is itself a project that unfolds alongside the project of, on the one hand, communicating accurate information from positions of authority, and on the other hand, figuring out some balanced approach to regulation and policy, the practice of the state, the practices of the corporations, what have you, that hopefully mitigate the impact of the flow of disinformation in a way that does minimal damage to the imperative of preserving free speech and First Amendment rights in society. We have to look at all of these things as unfolding along parallel tracks, and take for granted that there is no way to pursue each of them perhaps with the utmost optimization. Because I think, as you guys know, anytime you try to go for a 100% solution to a particular problem, you wind up triggering problems elsewhere, right? And so that's the issue. We just have to accept that. But if we have this goodwill track there, that's the stabilizing piece, which allows us, I think, ultimately to hold the other two in constructive tension over time. So that's how I look at it.
I think that's fantastic, and that's definitely an approach that I highly advocate. And once we're done here, I'd like to ask you about perhaps becoming involved in the mission of Braver Angels. But my concern here is that I've been doing some research on some of the stuff that Matt Taibbi puts out there, and he makes the case that currently, right now, America is effectively watching two movies. Mm-hmm. With Braver Angels, in my opinion, and people like in our circles who want to bring about this depolarization, want to come to some common ground. We're effectively up against a juggernaut. We have our media, which is enormous, that just ends up stuffing us into red and blue bubbles. Each side is meant to see each other as the enemy, and as a result, there's no common road to walk on. And even with an environment that between individuals who want to seek goodwill, if we cannot find a shared epistemology, if we cannot find a a way to speak to the other side, even if both sides have goodwill. Then each side's perspective of goodwill will eventually shoot off in two different directions. And unless we find a way to circle around and come together, I don't see how this is going to be, how we can truly win this two front war, as far as I see, between red and blue.
So I actually think that the goodwill piece is the answer to the epistemological problem, provided that we leverage it in a way to where goodwill itself creates the context for us to begin to reconstruct a shared epistemology together, right? So that's where the goodwill piece ultimately has to go. I'm frequently confronted with the question that says, well, how do we bring Americans together when we are watching, split screen different movies on each side? How do we do it when we don't share an epistemology, a basic relationship to facts? But the thing that we always have to bear in mind is that even when we do share an understanding of particular facts, it is still typically the case, or generally the case, that the social significance, the interpretation of the significance of those facts can themselves split us in direction of severe polarization, right? Because our basis for evaluating the significance of the facts that we hold in common in terms of understanding to be true, itself is filtered through whether or not we see, the parties, the parties involved in a certain sort of factual reality as being motivated in one way or another on the basis of our sort of social understanding of them. And so, just as an example, here's the thing where Donald Trump's conversation with the Ukrainian prime minister, we know on a factual level every single word that transpired in that conversation. That is not an instance where we are looking at different sets of facts. It's an instance where we're looking at the same facts and interpreting them wildly differently because we have divergent moral frames. And that actually precedes the facts, right? In that conversation, Donald Trump made the statement that he was concerned about corruption in the Ukraine, that he was concerned about the Biden's presence in Ukraine, and thought that that was something that the Ukrainian prime minister ought to look into. And then on the transcript, shortly after that, he makes the point that they're considering funding for the Ukrainian government. And I forget the exact context of the funding question. But the whole conversation is there. People are reading the same conversation. Some people are reading the juxtaposition of these points in the conversation as completely innocent. Other people are reading it as a flagrant telegraphing of the fact that this was a quid pro quo that President Trump was putting on the table, right? But it's the same facts. We agree on the facts of what happened in terms of what was said. The implications is what we're diverging on, because some of us are looking at Donald Trump as an ultimately sort of, basically honest figure who's advocating for America first. And we know, if we're coming from this frame, that Joe Biden is a part of a corrupt leftist establishment that is seeking to undermine American values by sowing corruption throughout the international landscape. Therefore, Joe Biden is already someone who we are disposed to think of as undermining American interest and predisposed to corruption. Donald Trump is there to clean up the corruption. He's there to root out the swamp. Of course, Donald Trump would be concerned about Joe Biden's activities in the Ukraine. And of course, that would have nothing to do with any sort of larger, self-interest on Trump's part, other than the fact that Trump is there to clean up the swamp. That's movie number one. And there's movie number two, is the other frame, which says that Donald Trump came into our national conversation sowing disinformation, speaking lies, uttering half-truths and full falsehoods, and doing it for the purposes of his own personal enrichment, his own personal aggrandizement, all for the sake of serving his own ego, his own power. Naturally, he said what he said in this conversation about targeting the Bidens because the Bidens are a threat to his power. Biden is his likely opponent in a presidential contest. He's the person who's polling most high among Trump's own constituents. Of course, he said that as a way of hanging over the prospect of losing funds over the head of the Ukrainian government as a means of undermining his political opponent, because that's exactly the shady sort of thing that Donald Trump does, right? And so, the agreement on the facts of what happened in that case, in terms of just the literal progression of the conversation, has no bearing on how we interpret, ultimately the implications of those facts. And I could give you more mundane examples. Mm-hmm. This is why, again, I return to the transcendent piece. This is why I return to the goodwill piece, so on and so forth. And it's not about having, focusing your empathy on Donald Trump or Joe Biden. But it is about recognizing that even Donald Trump himself, as outsized a figure as he is, but he emerged as president of the United States as a consequence of social ruptures and breakdowns of trust between political groups, between, to a certain degree, subcultural and racial groups, between institutions, between ideologies. Trump emerged as the outgrowth of all sorts of ruptures and breakdowns in trust that produced Trump, or at least produced the opportunity for Trump to come in and exploit and then exacerbate that division.
Yes.
So this is why this larger project of beginning to rebuild these bonds so that we can reconstruct a shared empirical framework or epistemological framework. Well, this is the connection, in other words, between the goodwill piece and the shared epistemology. Because as long as the goodwill piece is absent, even we will tend to get divergent facts, but even where facts converge, it won't guarantee social cohesion. Because fundamentally, the thing that unites us in community is not so much shared epistemology as much as it is a shared epistemology that proceeds from a shared fabric of goodwill and trust, you could say.
Yeah, I think that is brilliantly put. Mr. Wood, I want to thank you endlessly for agreeing to come on and have this conversation with us. I think it's been incredibly enlightening. And I would recommend everybody go check out Braver Angels. I think the work that you guys are doing is tremendous. All the links will be posted in the description of the video below, as well as your social media links. But Mr. Wood, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, Vincent, Bruce, it's a real pleasure. Your podcast came to my attention not too long before you guys reached out to me. And let me just compliment you guys on the work that you're doing and the conversations that you're having. I mean, it's a breath of fresh air. And yeah, you are more than invited to join some of the work that we do at Braver Angels and to learn more about our stuff. And I say that to your audience as well. You guys are on the right track, and I hope that you keep going.
Ooh, thank you so much. Yeah, that means an absolute lot. And we hope to see you again in the future. Thank you so much. This was great.
All right, now. Thank you.
All right.